Okay, morning. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Paul Dryburgh. I am currently acting chair of the British Association for Local History. And for those of you that don't know, I'm sure most of you are aware, the BALH is the national charity which promotes local history and serves local historians. We also publish our academic journal, The Local Historian, in which Dennis's articles have featured over many decades. And we also have our quarterly newsletter, Local History News. Hopefully, many of you will have noticed that over the past 2 years during the pandemic, the association has been much more active in its online delivery of webinars, skills webinars, and trying to, create a much greater online community for local history and local historians in the country. And we've had some really great engagement, large audiences for some really interesting work. I should also say, full declaration, I'm also honorary secretary of the Lincoln Record Society. I am from Lincoln myself, and I was fortunate enough, unlike many of you, I've not engaged academically with much of Dennis's work. I'm an academic medievalist and archivist, but I was fortunate to meet Dennis when I was training to be an archivist about 15 years ago, and I was working at the Lincolnshire Archives on a voluntary basis, and I met Dennis at LRS AGMs. He was very kind to me and gave me a little bit of work on Cannock and Branston, which is where I went to school and which of course where the Mills family lived or live still. So I was fortunate enough to meet, to encounter Dennis on a more personal level rather than a kind of research level. I should also say that I'd like to thank the other societies that are involved in today's event, so the Lincoln Record Society, the Survey of Lincoln, and the Society for Lincolnshire History and Archaeology. And one person who hasn't yet been mentioned, but I think is crucial to the development of today's conference, is Ian George, who's the current chairman of the SLHA, who I think is in the audience. And so thanks, Ian. I know you can't comment, but thanks to you all. And also thanks to all of our speakers for being so engaged with us and hopefully going to enjoy a great day. So our first session has 2 speakers in it, and our first speaker is Dr. Sarah Holland. And when I find my screen, which has got the right bio on it, apologies, Sarah. Sarah is assistant professor at the University of Nottingham, and she's author of Communities in Contrast, Doncaster and its Rural Hinterland, 1830 to 1870. It's a very recent publication, and that has engaged extensively with Dennis's work on open and closed villages. So Sarah's talk this morning is entitled Communities in Contrast, Revisiting the Open-Closed Parish Debate, Doncaster's Rural Hinterland, 1830 to 1880. I'm going to hand over to Sarah now. And I understand that when we trialed this, Sarah's PowerPoint was visible, but Sarah wasn't. So if you lose sight of Sarah, but can see her slides, we might have to live with that. Let's try it, Sarah, anyway. Let's go for it.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, I'll try this. Yeah, when we trialed it yesterday, I disappear at this point, so apologies if that happens. Okay, it's worse than that. I can't even see the presentation this time. Just a second. Should be there in a second. There we go.
Here we go. Right, I can see your. If you just share the slideshow now. Yeah, but you have gone.
We can't slideshow. Yeah, you can't see me. Right.
No, but I can see the slideshow. So I guess carry on.
Is that okay? Yes.
That's fine. I can see the slides.
And you can hear me okay?
Yeah, that's fine, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. It's an honour to be speaking at this event, especially as the work of Dennis Mills has had such a profound impact on my research and career. In this talk, I will be exploring the inspirations that have informed my research and the role Dennis Mills's work played in that. I'll also be discussing the application of this open-closed debate in relation to the Doncaster district, with particular emphasis on the relationship between rural communities and the market town of Doncaster. And finally, I'll consider the debate and model in light of my recent research on health and the countryside as well. So in terms of the inspiration, all historical research is inspired by something or someone, perhaps by a personal quest to know more about a family or a community, perhaps by curiosity, a desire to know and understand more about the landscapes that we grow up in, inhabit and visit, or perhaps by the work of a historian, a book or a talk attended. And in terms of my inspiration for the research into the rural communities in the Doncaster district, all three apply. I grew up in the Doncaster district and wanted to know more about the rural communities that were seemingly familiar to me. I also knew that I had ancestors who were agricultural labourers in the Doncaster district, as well as in Lincolnshire. I was extremely curious to know more about the rural landscapes I visited. Everywhere I went, I was interested and curious about that. And I suppose I was extremely lucky to be a part of a family where history and heritage were an integral part of my life. And then, of course, around the time of my undergraduate degree, I came across Dennis Mills's Lord and Peasant, which we've heard about from Kate Tiller earlier, and was inspired by the ideas presented here. So you've got my sort of early inspiration there on location through to the academic work that inspired my research and book. So the model of rural society that inspired me to begin with was this summary of the open closed communities, summarised as Kate Tiller says on page 117 of Lord and Peasant. And it particularly led me to think, how and why have rural communities developed, but also why have they been classified as they have, and the extent to which it's possible to differentiate between them. And the model was both interpretive and predictive, in which three main arguments were incorporated. The first, that rural settlements could be classified in accordance with land ownership with distinctively different characteristics dependent on the concentration of land ownership, which we see here in this summary form on the screen. The second, that there's a causal relationship between the land ownership and those characteristics. And the third, that a negative dependency operated between villages, with closed communities not only dependent on open communities for labour, but also responsible for exacerbating the problems of overcrowding and poverty in them. The open-closed model, of course, has its origins in the ideas and terminology of the 19th century poor law, with responsibility placed upon landowners for the relative conditions or characteristics to be found in open and closed parishes or settlements. And as such, the terms open and closed were emotionally charged. The model became the basis for an ongoing and enduring debate about rural communities, including my own work on Doncaster. Inevitably, there have been critiques of this model, most notably Sarah Banks's work on Castleacre in Norfolk, emphasising the impact of absentee land ownership and the dangers of replicating the confusion and inconsistencies surrounding the use of terminology in the 19th century. Barry Rear also noted that an inherent weakness of the model was that few places actually correspond to it. Nevertheless, and it's incredibly important to acknowledge that in spite of challenges posed by the model, firstly, Dennis Mills didn't intend the model to be the end point. He recognised its limitations, stating that the distinction between open and closed was not always a sharp one, advocating the use of a continuum, seeing these communities as part of a spectrum, and encouraging further research to test and refine it. And I suppose to add to that, his work on open and close extended beyond this model, and his work on rural communities and rural society extended beyond the open and closed debate. Secondly, a lot of research into rural communities exists because of Dennis Mills's work, and this model being a starting point for that research as well. So really important, despite perhaps some issues that we have with it as well. So the focus for my presentation is the Doncaster district, and looking at how we can apply that model to the Doncaster district, or rather Doncaster and its rural hinterland. And as we heard from Kate Tiller earlier, Dennis Mills was interested in this notion, although it wasn't necessarily central to the model or debate around open and close. The Doncaster district is in the southern portion of the old West Riding of Yorkshire, what is now South Yorkshire. It's a region renowned for its industry and urban settlements, but nevertheless a region where the history is interwoven with a rich tapestry of agriculture and rural communities. Doncaster was a country market town, and even with the arrival of the Great Northern Railway in 1848 and the establishment of the Great Northern Railway Works in 1853, which ushered in a period of change, including villages being transformed into railway suburbs, and the area close to the railway becoming a hub for industrial development. For the market town, it remained important in terms of agricultural trade, knowledge networks, the hiring of agricultural workers, and the shaping of civic identity. And it was this region that was the basis of my PhD and Communities and Contrast, my first book there. There is evidence of those key characteristics and determinants outlined by Mills in those rural communities, although with greater complexities and nuance that the model inevitably cannot account for. In terms of land ownership, the need to deconstruct land ownership and move beyond the concentration of land ownership was apparent in order to examine agency and leadership, both amongst landowners and other groups in rural society. Ultimately, Doncaster's rural hinterland was characterised by contrasts between communities that transcended land ownership. Rural communities will never fit into neat boxes or conform to those models, although that doesn't necessarily render those models redundant, as I noted earlier. A key area for further work remains the interrelationship between rural communities and between town and countryside. And this is the focus for the next part of the paper. My research demonstrated that the interrelationships between rural communities and between the countryside and market towns was complex and cannot be reduced to the negative dependency implied by the poor law reports or the summary of Mill's model. And of course, that was important in terms of Mills's wider work as well. Moreover, these interrelationships, often but not always reciprocal, are vital in explaining how and why rural communities developed during the mid-19th century. So as part of that, knowledge networks are incredibly important in terms of those interconnections between communities and between the town and the country. Agriculture, and specifically agricultural advancements in those rural communities, relied on knowledge, ability, skill, as well as wealth. J.H. Charnock, in his prize-winning article on farming in the West Riding of Yorkshire, which was published in the Journal of the Royal Agricultural Society of England, attributed agricultural improvements in the county more to experience and the confidence to experiment than mechanisation alone. As such, the generation and communication of agricultural knowledge was important. Farmers' clubs and agricultural societies formed important knowledge networks, providing a vehicle for individual and collective agency. The emphasis was on cultivating agricultural knowledge through practical experience and the sharing of ideas, which was supported by local landowners, other rural elites, practical agriculturalists, including local farmers. The management structure and rules of these clubs and societies tended to be hierarchical, with the local landowners, clergy, and other rural elites dominating the decision-making processes. Nevertheless, there were opportunities for smaller farmers and agricultural workers to be involved with some of these organisations. The activities of village-based agricultural clubs had influence beyond the rural communities that hosted them. For example, the Sprotbrough Farmers Club, hosted by an estate village, had a geographical scope of 5 miles. Although fairly limited in scale, it meant that the villages within this catchment area were predominantly situated on the magnesian limestone, which in turn meant that the club meetings could focus on agricultural practices relevant to that geological area. Moreover, local farmers spoke about their practical experiences, enabling the club to determine which of the latest agricultural ideas were relevant and applicable and how others could be adapted. The Braithwell Farmers Club was slightly different. In the absence of a dominant resident landowner, a large owner-occupier farmer provided the impetus for the club. Although membership was perhaps still relatively limited, the club was more open, with opportunities for smaller farmers and agricultural labourers to partake in the activities. And the annual ploughing matches were considered effective in stimulating greater efficiency amongst agricultural workers. Town-based agricultural organisations, such as the Doncaster Agricultural Society, and we can see some of their publicity and a medal they awarded on the screen at the moment, they intersected with local, regional and national knowledge networks. Local landowners occupied prominent positions on the committee, and in spite of lower subscription rates and show entrance fees, the majority of local farmers who engaged with the Doncaster Agricultural Society and its shows were the larger tenant farmers or owner-occupiers. Nevertheless, it still stimulated interconnectivity with the village farmers' clubs and thus facilitated opportunities for the exchange of knowledge across the district and across social groups. And this is evident in the publications and awards associated with this society. The marketing centre, the market town of Doncaster, is also very important in those interconnections. It occupied a pivotal position in the local rural economy, facilitating the marketing of agricultural produce. Through improvements to the market facilities in the town, Doncaster Corporation increased its agency in agricultural matters and in the economies of rural communities in the district. A new covered corn market was constructed in 1844. It was a response to not only the demands of local farmers, but also to competition from nearby towns that had already rebuilt their market buildings. It was reported to combine ornament with utility, including three key designs, elements of space, light and shelter, important to both sellers and buyers. Practical considerations were not overlooked during the next phase of market redevelopment, although increasingly civic ambitions came to the fore. And this is particularly evident in the new corn exchange, which opened in 1873 and is the one depicted on the screen there. The mayor described this as one of the grandest and most comfortable corn exchanges in the country. Again, it responded to competition in the region, and it responded to demands for better marketing facilities in the town. But it was more than just a hub for trade. It was also used for concerts, performers, events and meetings, and it constituted an important civic space while still fulfilling a practical function serving the local agricultural district. The Doncaster Corporation were therefore an external agent, determining the relationship between town and country, and thus impacting on rural communities and their inhabitants while constructing its own civic identity. Notably, the relationship with agriculture and the importance of what they said was carefully managing relations with agricultural workers from the local rural communities was at the forefront of many corporation meetings and was embedded in the civic identity being forged in 19th century Doncaster. In that market town of Doncaster were held the hiring fairs. Farm service was a prominent feature of the Victorian labour market in the Doncaster district. The hiring fairs, or Doncaster statutes, brought together agricultural workers, rural inhabitants, farmers and rural elites from across the district. They provide a lens through which to explore the complexities of rural communities and the interconnections between town and country. The wages and working conditions of farm servants were largely shaped here rather than in the rural communities where they would work. The hiring fairs provided an opportunity for farm servants to bargain and negotiate better wages. This was in part due to location. The close proximity to industrial and urban employment kept agricultural wages relatively high in the district. Higher wages were also more likely to be secured during times of agricultural prosperity, when demand for labour often exceeded the supply of farm servants, and by the more skilled and experienced workers. So this bestowed some agency on some of the farm workers, albeit engendering social hierarchies in the workforce. And we can see that on the quote on the screen, that the so-called best hands, the experienced people, were being hired very quickly, but the young and inexperienced boys being hard to dispose of. Resistance to the hiring fairs was too players from different rural communities, including the farmers and the clergy. So farmers didn't want to pay increasingly higher wages, and the clergy wanted to reform what they viewed as a demoralising hiring practice. And here we have a quote from one of the local clergy in the Doncaster district saying that here is a growing wish on the part of the parents and the farmers to see this kind of thing abolished. He said that, and then 30 to 40 years later, the hiring fairs are still going strong, which suggests that the farm servants themselves, those families and those people, see a value in it. And indeed, they asserted themselves, many refusing to use alternative registry offices set up or being driven inside to be hired. They also showed an awareness of not only hiring the economic bargaining power that hiring fairs afforded them, but also that they were an integral part of the farming calendar, a time of leisure as well as securing employment. So the spheres of influence in connecting and affecting rural communities and those who lived and worked in them was far-reaching and stretched beyond the rural community itself, and a series of threads that interconnect them and affected their development as well. Now, in the last part of the talk, I just want to talk a little bit about health in rural communities. This looks at the connections with my latest research on rural communities and health. I'm writing a book at the moment under contract on this topic called Farming, Psychiatry and Rural Society, which particularly looks at mental illness in rural communities and the role of asylum and hospital farms. And I'm also working on an article more generally about health in the countryside. But as I planned what I wanted to say for this event, I realised there was scope to revisit the open-closed debate once more, particularly in terms of land ownership and the characteristics of rural communities and their effects on health in rural communities, but also to acknowledge the work Dennis Mills did on public health in Lincolnshire. So to demonstrate my thoughts on this, I'm going to begin with a case study of William Oldham, a landowner in the Doncaster district, and his connection with the psychiatric institutions in the region, and then briefly consider indicators of health in the countryside. So the Oldham family were cloth merchants from Leeds and owned land in the Doncaster district during the 19th century. William Oldham Jr., who I'm going to be talking about, owned the Frickley estate and increasingly took responsibility for the land the family owned at Warmsworth. He was a politician, businessman, and an active participant in local affairs, including being a poor law guardian. He retained an active interest in the management of agricultural land owned by the family. He had a very hands-on approach, and this is evidenced by his personal diaries, notebooks, and farm memoranda books, whether walking the land, undertaking drainage schemes, talking to tenants, or attending village events. It's all recorded in those books. And as a member of the Board of Guardians, he's often engaging with matters around the poor law and also visiting psychiatric institutions of the region. So the asylums, as they were then called, at Wakefield and Wadsley and Sheffield. It was not unusual for landowners to be involved to differing extents in pauper lunatic asylums and other poor law institutions. Here we have an example of the interconnection between land ownership, rural communities, and an institution, or rather a constructed rural community in the form of a psychiatric institution. The influence and agency that Oldham exerted in his official roles reflected aspects of the way in which he managed and engaged with the land he owned. Many of the entries in his notebooks and diaries refer to farming at the two institutions, were reminiscent of the notes he recorded in relation to the land, the farmers and farm workers in the Doncaster district. Many of them are equally fleeting references, offering a tantalising but often very brief insight into his life and work. So, for example, with regards the West Riding Lunatic Asylum, he noted in 1866 that they seem to kill all their own beef at this asylum. I suggest they also kill the mutton. He comments on the farm bailiff being an excellent man, and then notes in October 1866 that all meat is now killed for the asylum, the farmer buying the cattle, it now has to be slaughtered in Wakefield owing to the cattle plague regulations. And then the book on the screen and the quote there comes from October 1893. He's again at the Wakefield Asylum, and he mentions that he goes over the farm buildings. He saw the spacious pig yard with its multitude of black Berkshire pigs, beautiful animals. And he goes on to comment on the poultry yard and the cattle. Similarly, at Wadsley, he makes notes of the staff wages, the proposed site of farm buildings, the farm buildings being soon to be completed, that patients would work on the farm, the advertisement placed in the field for farm bailiff, the expenditure on agricultural implements, and the number of livestock being purchased. References such as this are illuminating for a number of reasons. Firstly, they are indicative of concerns expressed that many of those connected with the oversight of such institutions were from farming or landowning backgrounds, and therefore more interested in the institutional economies and the farming enterprises than the patients. In Oldham's case, he does refer to the patients on occasions, but mainly from these more economic perspectives. Secondly, his involvement and the ways in which he recorded these were indicative of how he managed and discussed the land he owned, suggesting an interconnectivity or interrelationship between the varied roles he had. And thirdly, not only did his knowledge of farming and land management determine how he approached his role here, but his work in connection with the asylum and poor law provided reflective spaces in which ideas about farming and land management could develop, and in turn were likely to influence the estates he presided over. Health is also a fundamental characteristic of rural communities, affecting the lives of rural inhabitants in a multitude of ways. Evidence of health in rural communities is evident in the poor law reports that underpinned the open-closed debate of the 19th century, as well as parliamentary inquiries into agricultural employment, the reports of medical officers and local newspapers. Health in the countryside was closely interlinked with living and working conditions and the fortunes of agriculture, but also agency, rural relations, and attitudes to the rural poor and to morality. Despite the notion of the countryside as a popular, despite the popular notion of the countryside as a rural idyll, a space that was healthier to live and work compared to town and cities, there was increasing awareness of rural poverty and ill health in the countryside. Contrasts were being drawn between the north and south, but they often hide the differentiation between rural communities and the complex interplay between lived experiences versus attitudes and interpretations. Indeed, while to a certain extent the conditions of rural poor were shaped by the attitudes and actions of the rural elites, not only were there disparities in health and in living and working conditions in places that shared similar landowning structures, but concerns were shared by reformers in both estate and open communities, as was ambivalence to the plight of the poor. And some of the quotes on the screen here sort of point to that. So in the 1867-8 Commission on the Royal Commission into the Employment of Children, Young Persons and Women in Agriculture, they frequently comment on whether work was considered injurious to health. And in doing so, they often link that to morals. So landowners, farmers, and even some members of the clergy would say, no, it's not injurious to their health or morals. No injury to their health and morals. It's a very repetitive phrase we see in those reports. Indeed, if we look at what John Bladworth said, and he's a landowner and farmer, they are never called upon to do work unfitted to their strength, and the fresh open air is conducive to their health. In contrast, the Reverend C.E. Thomas of Warmsworth said, I would restrict females under the age of 12 or 13 from going to work, and certainly during the winter months, females should not work, as many go out poorly clad and worse shod, and so get into bad health. I consider good cottage accommodation most essential both to health, comfort, and mortality. I have known the finest and naturally healthiest children waste away through so many sleeping in a confined space. And on the subject of cottage accommodation and health, a number of reports reveal the extent of poor rural housing and the impact this had on the health of inhabitants. And increasingly, there were publications emphasising the interrelationship between living conditions, health, comfort, and well-being. as well as the moral character of the inhabitants. The shortage of cottage accommodation was pivotal to this, and obviously a factor that we can see underpinning the open-close debate, and that idea of a scarcity of cottages in estate villages being an evil of the open-closed parish system. We can go a step further, though, and see this idea of health. A number of people commented on this issue of having to walk 3 to 4 miles to get to work. And the quote on the screen comes from the 7th report of the medical officer in 1865, noting this insufficient cottage accommodation in a number of places, and saying, you know, a walk in the fresh air may be pleasant to the engine smith, but is no luxury to the ploughman, and that people only did that because of poverty. The Reverend C. Thomas, who's mentioned in the second quote there, he also said in relation to that distance to work, it must in the end tell upon the workman. There is, of course, much more that could be said about health in the countryside. This is just a brief insight on some reflections. There's more that could be said in terms of the open-close debate, and certainly more that could be said more generally about health in the countryside, and particularly in terms of my work on mental illness in the countryside and the farms managed by those psychiatric institutions. But hopefully it's given a flavour. So to bring this talk to a close, I would emphasise 3 points. Firstly, the influential role that Dennis Mills's work has played, not only in terms of my research, but that of many others, and is therefore fundamentally important. In spite of the problems and critiques inherent to the debate and the model, it's provided and continues to provide a springboard for further research. Secondly, that in terms of the Doncaster district and revisiting the open-close debate, the rural communities provided evidence in line with a number of the claims put forward by Mills, but also highlighted the importance of agency and leadership rather than simply concentrated land ownership. That ultimately Doncaster's rural hinterland was characterised by contrasts between communities that transcended land ownership, and that the interrelationship between rural communities and between town and country were pivotal in the development of rural society. And thirdly, there is a lot of potential to widen the scope of the open-close debate, not only in terms of the interrelationship between rural communities and between town and country, but also in terms of health in the countryside. So thank you. I will stop sharing there. Oh, the publishers of my book, Communities in Contrast, which is published by University of Hertfordshire Press, also emailed me to say that the book is apparently in their Christmas sale at the moment, if anybody's interested. So there you go. It's a bargain.
Yeah, Sarah, either you can do it or somebody else can find it and drop it into the chat with the detail of where the discounted offer is, and everybody can see it. But take your time anyway. Thanks for that. That was great. I mean, obviously, so rich and kind of so much engagement there with Dennis's work in your own work. And we have actually got a couple of questions. I was going to say we can take questions now if anybody's got any burning questions, but obviously with Martin discussing the open and closed system too, there might be opportunities for questions to both speakers at the end as well. So we'll take some questions now. So if anybody's got any burning questions, do put them in the Q&A box, please. Sarah, the first question comes from Valerie Coyne. She asked, did the prevalence of the Pilgrim Fathers and other separatists in the Bawtry area influence attitudes in the Doncaster area?
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you, Valerie. So it's an interesting question. Yes and no to a certain extent, yes. So the way I've always seen this is, again, those interconnections. So not necessarily a direct link, always, as in a direct link from sort of that period through to the later period, but yes, in terms of the connections between those immediate communities around Bawtry, but also Westerfield and around there, feeding into some of the sort of dissent and nonconformity that lasts into the 19th century as well, and which is, although it's a lot more prevalent in the open multi-freeholder villages than in the estate, that we do see under the surface in a lot more communities. So I think that there is that sort of knock-on effect of ideas being transferred, but also in terms of communities who've had that long legacy, and it's a part of their history, passing on those ideas in a sort of an indirect way to other communities as well.
Okay, thanks, Oliver. Andrew, I know Andrew Walker has a question, which he's put in the chat for us. But Andrew, you're on screen. You can ask your question verbally if you like.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Thanks very much, Sarah. That was great. Apart from hiring fairs, is there evidence of antipathy within the corporation of Doncaster towards some aspects of rural ways infecting the town? I'm just thinking about the development of urbane sensibilities towards the end of the 19th century.
Yes and no. Okay, yes and no. Yes, there is in a wider sense of this sort of morality. There's a sense of wanting to sort of emphasize the morality element to such an extent that it often divides the town and country. But what was particularly interesting is actually the narrative was slightly different in the fact that they wanted to emphasize that the rural population coming in were almost, pure and innocent people coming in. And it was only when they mixed with townsfolk did things go wrong almost in that way. And I think all of this seems to be part of what was a careful management of the situation, because the town is changing quite rapidly towards the mid to late 19th century, but it still is very dependent on the agriculture. It's still very dependent on the landowners, the rural communities in different ways. And there's almost that very sort of fine line of managing everything. Also wanting to change things economically and wanting to reform them. Quite a lot of what I found was simply economic motivations, civic motivations that they often put in terms of moral motivations. So they took on the clergy's arguments of what should be happening both in rural communities and in the towns. But often if you dig deeper, you can see there's more economic or civic motivation to what they're wanting to do there as well. Which is quite an interesting one in itself. Why do that? And a lot of it, when you sort of read the minutes of the meetings and sort of get beyond what went public, is a careful managing that they sort of see these as quite potentially dangerous people who could affect them in that way, and therefore wanting to manage that situation quite carefully as well.
Great, thanks, Sarah.
Great. No more questions yet in the screen. No, I've got a question purely out of ignorance, and it's probably a completely ill-formed question. The coming of the railways, and particularly with Doncaster being such an important hub, how does that impact on those rural communities, the ones that either do get the railway that comes to them, or the ones that don't? Is there a difference there, or do people are there local campaigns? The railway must come to us, we need it for X reason, which then feeds into what you're talking about? Or is that completely red herring? I'm just making that up.
No, not at all. There is a lot of interest in the railways in the area, and particularly having them serve the rural communities, but interestingly serve them in a way in which, say, some of the landed estates were very specific about where they wanted those lines to run. There was local people who, after the railways had come, were talking about obviously the environmental impact and the way in which you've got this nice landscape, which had been sort of a pleasure landscape before, still in the estate community, still landed estates that haven't been overly developed in any way, but now I've got this railway coming through the middle of them as well. Elsewhere, it is more about the trade and the commerce associated with it. So on one part of Doncaster, you get a lot of the maltings, the brewery, using it and interconnecting. So you're getting a strong connection between both the agriculture, but also the trade, the food processing industries that go with that as well, and a greater interconnection between them on the basis of that. So yeah, there's a lot of interest, but and generally sort of positive that they want to get the advantages of the trade from that, but also different ways in which they actually manifests itself in the area as well.
Excellent, thanks. That's great. I think I will discharge you from your responsibilities for now. So thanks for that, Sarah. That was great. But I think anybody who formulates questions during Martin's talk for Sarah as well, do keep popping them in the Q&A box. But we're going to move now to our second speaker of the session, who is Dr. Martin Watkinson, who is an former honorary visiting fellow at the University of Leicester, where he undertook his doctorate in the Centre for English Local History. Between 1976 and 2011, Martin worked in a variety of management roles at the Open University. In the context of this morning's talk, his work on power and authority in English parishes, 1750 to 1850, reconceptualising the closed parish model, is the title of this morning's talk. Martin tells me, and I'm very jealous about this, that as a native of Lincolnshire myself, and living in London at the moment, he has just returned to Lincolnshire and is loving the big skies and the landscape, and no doubt the snow this week as well. So I will hand over to Martin. Hopefully the screen sharing we can see you during your talk. Oh, and thanks, Sarah, you put it in the offer in the chat. It's coming. Yeah, I can see the PowerPoint, so do go ahead. Although you're on mute. Oh, it's better here.
Yeah, okay, you can hear me okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Sorry, yeah, that's fine. Carry on. You're on mute again now, though. There we go. That's better. Thanks.
Okay, you can hear me now. Okay, thank you, Paul. I had the great pleasure of working at the Open University when Dennis was a staff tutor there, and I count myself extremely fortunate to have been able to count on his advice and support when in later years I was undertaking my PhD at Leicester. Indeed, my thesis was inspired by Dennis's work on open and closed parishes. In this, I was not alone, as Sarah has already explained, and it's fair to say that Dennis's work has influenced a whole generation of social historians writing about English rural life in the 19th century. It's an outstanding legacy. And I want to celebrate that legacy today by building on the foundations that Dennis has left us. And doing that, I want to specifically focus on Dennis's work on closed parishes. So let's begin by defining our terms. Open and closed parishes constitute two halves of a model of rural settlement. As Sarah has explained, parishes are assigned to this model according to the number of landowners that were in the parish. So open parishes typically contain many small proprietors, and closed parishes were generally dominated by a single landlord, or at least not more than 2 or 3 major landowners. Dennis didn't invent this model. It had been articulated in the 19th century to explain differences in the way that power and authority were exercised in the countryside. However, Dennis developed it in 2 important ways. First, he suggested that open and closed parishes occupied the opposite ends of a broad spectrum, and between these 2 extremes were ranged a number of other intermediate parish types, including open parishes which contained both large and small proprietors, and closed parishes in which the landlord was an absentee rather than a resident. Second, as Kate and Sarah have already noted, Dennis argued that each of these parish types was associated with differences in other variables. So closed parishes tended to have smaller populations than open parishes because a single landowner could control the number of houses being built in the parish. Closed parishes also contained fewer numbers of poor people because a single landowner could prevent the influx of new families, and they therefore had lower poor rates, and so on. Dennis didn't define in detail the characteristics of his two intermediate parish types, beyond making two observations on parishes with absentee owners, which is the subject of my talk today. So on parishes with an absentee or non-resident landlord, he said, landlords tended to intervene less in the affairs of close parishes in the far reaches of their estates than in parishes close to their main house. And secondly, that in parishes where the landlord lived elsewhere, social leadership was exercised by the parson and the large tenant farmers. Now, I want to pick up where Dennis left off, and I want to explore these ideas a bit more. And in the process, I want to suggest that closed parishes with non-resident or absentee landlords were very different from closed parishes with resident landlords. I'll illustrate my remarks by drawing on some research I've been undertaking in the parish of Humberston in Lincolnshire. It's a well-documented village, and in the 19th century, it was a closed parish with an absentee landlord. There was just one village in the parish, so from now on, I shall use the terms parish and village interchangeably, though I know it may offend some of the purists amongst you. Humberston is a large village immediately to the south of Cleethorpes and about 5 miles from Grimsby. The top half of the parish is now largely residential, but the bottom half is still agricultural. In the 19th century, before the growth of Grimsby and Cleethorpes, Humberston was a small settlement containing just 200 to 250 people. The parson and 8 farmers dominated the parish. The rest of the working population was made up of agricultural labourers and farm servants and a small handful of craftsmen. All the land and all the houses in the parish were owned by a single landlord. This is him, Robert Smith, a Midlands banker and London financier who became an MP for Nottingham and a friend of William Pitt. It was Pitt who raised him to the peerage as the first Lord Carrington in 1796. The Carringtons held the estate through 3 generations until the 3rd Lord Carrington sold it in 1920. During the period of the Carringtons' ownership, Humberston was administered as an outlying portion of a large estate that was centred on High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire. His estate included other property in that county, as well as in London, the Lincolnshire Fens and Wales. So, using the experience of the Carringtons' ownership of Humberston, let's see how far we can substantiate Dennis's claim that landlords tended to be less interventionist in peripheral parts of their estate than in villages close to their residence. The first thing to say is that this is not just Dennis's view. Those studying individual estates have noticed that landowners were prepared to invest greater sums in estate villages next to the big house than in villages further afield. For example, Heather Clemenson and others have used the term distance decay to describe the tendency for farms, cottages, and other buildings to be progressively less stylish and ornamented the further they were from the owner's house. And others have remarked that landowners were less likely to have ministered to the moral and material welfare of their tenants in parishes where they were not resident. Susanna Wade Martins, for example, has written of outlying villages on the Hoken estate, where tenants rarely saw the landlord, and where, she says, the educational and philanthropic duties of the landlord were performed to only a minimal extent. To an extent, this was also true of Humberston. Lord Carrington had little interest in the aesthetics of the village. Many mud and stud cottages survived until the early 20th century, and new estate cottages were added only slowly to the housing stock. As a consequence, for most of the 19th century, Old cottages and new farmhouses stood side by side in a haphazard arrangement of ill-matched buildings, in stark contrast to the regular and compact morphology of estate villages on the Lincolnshire wolds, such as these belonging to the Earl of Yarborough. In many senses, this was understandable. It was not just that landlords were disinclined to spend money on outlying parts of their estate. It was also that they were physically remote and therefore unable to intervene in the day-to-day events of the village. However, I would like to suggest a number of caveats to this general picture. The first is that while non-resident proprietors may have been little interested in the physical landscape of remote parts of the estate, they were nevertheless concerned with those aspects of the estate that generated an income. In Humberston, the first Lord Carrington took a very close and personal interest in the improvement of the land. As soon as he acquired the estate at Humberston in 1792, Carrington engaged contractors to build a new sea wall, shown here in yellow, beyond the line of the old sea banks, which are highlighted in white. And then he began the process of reclaiming the salt marsh in between. In the following 2 years, he completed the enclosure of the parish by repossessing and dividing up the common meadows, the pasture, and the furze ground. He created 8 new farms. The smallest was 160 acres, the largest was 580 acres. These were huge farms by local standards. Elsewhere in the marsh, farms generally averaged around 40 to 60 acres in size. He championed progressive farming methods. He introduced cropping covenants as part of farm leases to ensure that tenant farmers adopted the new systems of crop rotation that underpinned the agricultural revolution elsewhere in England. And in particular, he insisted that clover and turnips should be sown in place of winter fallow. As this graph shows, clover was quickly adopted, but it was not until the introduction of cheap mass-produced pipe drains in the 1840s that turnips were grown successfully in the marsh and the bare fallow eliminated. Lord Carrington decided early on that he was not going to reside on his Lincolnshire estates, so he pulled down the old manor house in Humberston and replaced it with a farmhouse. It is shown here in a map of 1707, standing next to the church. He built new brick farmhouses on 5 of his farms. His son Robert built a 6th. So this is an impressive story of improvement and a significant intervention in parish affairs. But of course, it was motivated by a desire to protect and increase revenue by attracting farmers with capital who could be relied upon to pay their rents and improve the soil. This graph shows Lord Carrington's annual income from his Humberston estate in orange, compared with average rents across England as a whole, which are shown in blue. It shows that he increased rent 4 times between 1792 and 1825. And these increases push rents in Humberston slightly ahead of the general rise in agricultural rents. The returns clearly warranted his intervention. My second caveat is that we should not underestimate the landlord's capacity to undertake good works. The great landowners who presided over closed villages would, according to the conventions of the time, have been expected to have acted in a paternalistic way towards their tenants, demanding obedience and deference, but at the same time exercising benevolence by building decent cottages, charging a fair rent, and dispensing charity to those in distress. In Humberston, Carrington was in the fortunate position of inheriting a charitable bequest made by a former landlord of Humberston, known as the Humberston Charity. It allowed him to build and endow a free school, a schoolhouse, and a set of 6 almshouses, shown here. In ordinary circumstances, this would have properly marked the end of his involvement in parish affairs. It was remarked at the time that the use of the charity monies absolved Carrington of the need to do more for the welfare of his tenants. However, as the sole landowner in the parish, he was also obliged to act as chair of the trustees, and this required him to visit the parish once a year for the annual meeting of the trustees. This would have doubtless been an important occasion in the village, and it was certainly worthy of a photo when the 3rd Lord Carrington visited in his very smart car in 1907. However, these annual visits as chair of the trustees also brought Carrington unwittingly and unwillingly into a closer involvement in village affairs than he would have liked. For he was obliged to deal with the conduct of the schoolmaster, Reverend Joseph Gedge. Gedge was also the vicar. He was a strong-willed and ambitious young man who was prepared to challenge and confront Carrington on a number of issues. Reverend Gedge consistently complained about the inadequate size of the schoolhouse, the insufficiency of his stipend, and the onerous nature of his duties as both parson and schoolmaster. The schoolhouse, which is shown here, which also served as the parsonage, was actually the best house in the village. However, Gedge had married the daughter of a local gentry family. Here she is, the long-suffering Harriet Thorold, and he felt that it did not match his elevated social status. Lord Carrington, for his part, became exasperated by Gedge's extravagant lifestyle, his social pretensions, and his refusal to perform his duties as schoolmaster as rigorously as Carrington would have liked. This led to a running battle between the 1st and 2nd Lords Carrington and the Reverend Gedge, which lasted for 18 years and culminated in Gedge's dismissal as schoolmaster. This sparked 2 protracted lawsuits in the Court of Chancery. In the first, Gedge petitioned the Court of Chancery for unfair dismissal and won. As a result, he was reinstated. In the second, he sought to remove Carrington and Carrington's friends and family from the Board of Trustees. Though he was only partially successful, Carrington and his son essentially withdrew from the trust at that point and allowed Gedge free rein. "The affairs of Humberston," said the 2nd Lord Carrington, "have become a source of annoyance to me, as they were to my father." The Carringtons were not to intervene in parish affairs again. The third caveat that I'd like to add is that we should not discount the influence of the landlord's agent. The agent was likely to have had a greater degree of delegated authority in the administration of outlying properties than in the management of estate villages close to home. In these circumstances, the agent might well choose to act in areas where the landlord was negligent or disinterested. In the case of Humberston, Lord Carrington employed his business associate and friend, Thomas Thompson of Hull, as his agent in North Lincolnshire. This is him. Thompson performed the role that many other stewards or agents undertook. He selected the tenants, managed the leases, collected the rents, and acted as intermediary in communications between Carrington and the tenant farmers. But he was more than a cipher for Lord Carrington. He had considerable discretion to act on his own initiative. Thompson himself wrote, quote, "My noble friend, Lord Carrington, the owner of the estate, left me at liberty to fulfill his wishes and my own in any way I thought best." We can see this in several initiatives for which Thompson himself took responsibility, the most important of which was the provision of cow pastures for the labouring poor. We know that Thomas Thompson had a deep concern for the welfare of the poor. He was known in Hull as a reforming poor law guardian, seeking to keep the poor out of the workhouse by providing them with work, out relief and allotments. In Humberston, Thompson persuaded Carrington to set aside some 60 acres of pasture and meadow in the south of the parish for the use of the 13 cottagers who had lost their rights to common land when the parish had been enclosed in the 1790s. Thompson later extended this by the addition of another 24 acres in the north of the parish to benefit 5 other families. This number was later increased to 8. The arrangement brought considerable benefit to these 21 families who not only used milk to enrich their diet, but also sold surplus milk and butter to generate income and accumulate savings. Examination of the vestry minutes and the overseer's accounts for Humberston for the period up to 1834 reveals that no one in possession of a cottage and a cow applied for or received poor relief during this time. So landlord and tenant worked in different but interlocking spheres. In many ways, Carrington's firm managerial approach and Thompson's humanitarian sensibilities complemented each other very well. So what then of Dennis's second claim, that when the landlord was non-resident, the parson and the large tenant farmers assumed leadership of the parish? Well, the experience of Humberston suggests that matters were not always this straightforward. Let's look at the parson. In the ideal Victorian parish, the squire and parson worked harmoniously together to regulate parish affairs, to maintain social order, and to minister to the poor and the sick. Yet many parishes lacked not only a resident squire, but also a resident parson, leaving a vacuum in the heart of the village community. In 1780, 62% of English parishes lacked resident incumbents. And even as the Anglican revival was gaining pace in the 1830s, a half of all English parishes were still without resident parsons. In Humberston in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the living was held by a succession of non-resident clerics who appointed curates to perform their duties. However, the curates were also non-resident. They provided only a basic level of spiritual support. In 1790, the curate conducted services just once a fortnight in summer and every third week in winter. He celebrated communion just 3 times a year. A new era was ushered in during the 1820s when, as we've noted already, Lord Carrington installed the Reverend Gedge as the clergyman. Gedge was expected to teach in the school during the week and to conduct services in the church on Sunday. In fact, he was deficient in both roles. He appointed a junior teacher to take his place in the school on a fraction of his salary, and he took only 1 service a week. 2 of the leading farmers in the village alleged that it was a common opinion in Humberston and its neighbourhood that Reverend Gedge was above being a schoolmaster and he took little or no interest in the school. It seemed to them that Gedge spent more of his time outside the village than he did within it, visiting family and friends, officiating as clergyman in the second parish, sitting as a clerical GP, and after 1837, acting as a poor law guardian. It is perhaps telling that when Gedge fell out with Lord Carrington and petitioned against him in the Court of Chancery, he was unable to muster any supporting affidavits from his parishioners in Humberston. So if the clergy proved uncertain allies of absentee landlords, what then of that other important group, the tenant farmers? It has to be said that in Humberston, the tenant farmers exercised a high degree of authority. Because they occupied large farms, they were men of substance. Here is a wonderfully staged photograph of William Marshall, one of the leading tenant farmers, showing off his family, his fine house, his horse and groom, and one of his other servants. The farmer's social status was evident every week at church. Here, according to Reverend Gedge's daughter, the farmers occupied the pews here in the nave of the church, whilst the farm servants and the labourers sat up in the gallery, wearing, she says, their Sunday smocks. The farmers' social standing was given extra weight by their control of the vital components of parish life: employment, housing, and poor relief. Farmers were the major employers in the parish, providing work for more than 3/4 of the working population of Humberston in the century and a half after 1750. They were also the principal managers of the housing stock, providing tied cottages for farm labourers and lodgings for farm servants who were hired for the year. Farmers were also the principal ratepayers in the parish. Between them, they contributed at least 95% of the parish rate. And so they took it upon themselves to govern the parish. They dominated the vestry meetings, which was the principal unit of local government at that time. And they monopolised the parish offices, serving as church wardens, constables, and overseers of the poor. In this last capacity, they determined who was eligible to receive poor relief from the parish and under what terms. The farmers therefore formed a natural and powerful oligarchy. Apart from the vicar, there were few in the parish with the economic or social standing to challenge them. They were not a homogeneous group, but there is little evidence in the vestry minutes of conflict or rancour. They adopted and followed a remarkably consistent line. In respect of poor relief, for example, they fashioned an approach in which they jointly offered employment rather than poor relief to those who were able to work. And they provided relatively generous help and support to the elderly, the infirm, and single mothers. Even after the introduction of the poor law unions in 1834, they circumvented the ethos of the new poor law by keeping their poor at home, ostensibly putting them to work on the parish roads rather than sending them to the workhouse. The farmers also used their superior position to impose a polite moral code on the village, closing the alehouse, banning the village feast, and providing a Christian education for the children of the poor. Of course, we should not assume that others in the village willingly acquiesced to the imposition of a polite culture. The village may have lacked an alehouse, but it was a short walk to Cleethorpes, where there was an abundance of them. Despite occasional acts of defiance, there were few residents of Humberston who did not depend on the farmers for a roof over their heads, food on their table, and wages in their pockets. So what, in summary, can we say about closed parishes with non-resident landlords? Dennis brilliantly opened this discourse by mapping out the respective roles of landlords, clergy, and farmers. He depicted absentee landlords as remote figures who, because of the constraints of distance and perhaps of temperament, were reluctant to get involved in the affairs of distant parishes that they owned. In their absence, he said, the resident clergy and the principal tenant farmers provided social leadership in the parish. I think this has proved to be a perceptive analysis. In our examination of life in Humberston just now, we've indeed found landlord, parson and farmer, together with the landlord's agent, to have been the major repositories of power and authority in the parish. The balance of power between these groups may have been subject to change, and in Humberston, it may have been slightly different to that which Dennis expected to see. The landlord and his agent were slightly more interventionist, the parson somewhat less active than Dennis's formulation might have suggested. But the tenant farmers fully performed the leadership roles that Dennis envisaged for them. Indeed, it is clear that this sharing of functions between the landlord, the agent, the parson, and the leading tenant farmers was the defining characteristic of a parish without a resident landlord. And above all, it was what distinguished these parishes from those with a resident landlord, where a single authority figure ruled the roost. Thank you for letting me share these thoughts with you. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I've enjoyed being part of this tribute to Dennis.
No, Martin, thank you very much. That was great. I really enjoyed the nuanced portrayal you gave us and sort of the new perspectives you're given from just one local community.
Thank you.
I'm going to invite questions now. I've not seen any at the moment in the Q&A, but we've got sort of 5 to 10 minutes, so do put your hand up and ask for a question, pose a question. If there isn't a question at the moment, and Martin, again, this is my ignorance, stupid question, I'm going to ask it anyway. I noticed in that last slide you had the strongly Anglican for the resident landlord. What are there effects of non-conformity in these kind of relationships? And if so, how do they manifest themselves? Because obviously in Lincolnshire itself, it's the spread of Methodism and all the
yes, a very strong non-conformist county and a particularly strong Methodist county. I mean, the common perception of closed parishes is that they were strongholds of Anglicanism, because landlords tended to be Tory Anglicans who, sometimes with the help of the senior tenant farmers, wanted to keep these troublesome Methodists out of the parish and therefore didn't give them tenancies. But that wasn't so true of Lincolnshire. There were indeed landlords like the famous Squire of Brackenbury who became Methodists themselves, and indeed in that case built a chapel over their stable and welcomed John Wesley as a visiting minister. And there were other landlords like Yarborough, who himself was an Anglican and yet was quite happy to give tenancies to Methodists and even help them build chapels and schools in some of his parishes. So Lincolnshire was a lot more liberal than elsewhere, or certainly a lot more liberal than might be imagined. In Humberston, Carrington was an Anglican, but his agent, interestingly, was a Methodist.
Ah,
Not only a Methodist, a staunch Methodist,
really?
a lay preacher, a member of the Methodist Conference. And indeed, it was, and so he allowed Methodists to take tenancies in the village, and he and his successor, James Henwood, also a Methodist lay preacher, actively supported the Methodist cause there, persuaded Carrington to give them land, though Carrington refused to contribute to the building fund. But as the Methodists said in Humberston, it was due to the intervention of the agents that they were able to construct their first chapel. James Henwood, who had succeeded Thomas Thompson as agent, was in fact invited to give the opening service at the Methodist Chapel in 1836. So an interesting, another interesting way in which landlord and agent complemented each other, one Anglican, the other Methodist, but both willing to allow the other faith to practice in the other denomination to practice in the parish.
Great, excellent. Well, fortunately, my little first question has prompted some other questions, so I've got some questions to ask you now. So Martin White asks, how were the tenant farmers recruited or found? Were the new Carrington farms easily let? And what were these farmers doing before they took on the leases? So it's probably the same question, but it's kind of three different parts of it.
Yes. The first thing to say is that what Carrington and his agents did was to give preference in every case to people who were already living in the parish. And indeed, you could say this is one of the features of closed villages, closed parishes, that the landlord would usually look to the farmer's son or to another member of the family to take on the tenancy when the farmer left. And so you can see in Humberston and other parishes, these core families, generation after generation. In fact, the slide I showed of William Marshall standing with his family in front of his fine house, his family occupied that farmhouse for 250 years, from about 1763 until Nicholas Marshall died in the 1860s. A wonderful length of tenancy. So first preference was to offer farms to the local inhabitants, and then after that, I've never seen a farm in the tenancy of a farm in Humberston being advertised in the local press somewhere, not in Humberston. And you get the impression that it then became the agent who found and selected the tenant. So one of the big tenants in the early 19th century, and in fact one of the leading lights in the Methodist congregation, was recruited by Thomas Thompson, the agent from Yorkshire, and he travelled from Yorkshire to take up the tenancy of a rather nice farm in Humberston.
Lucky him. Okay,
Yeah.
Next question. So Gary Crossley asks, how mobile were the labourers between farms and outside of the parish?
That is a very good question. There's been quite a lot of research on this. Of course, it was always claimed that servants didn't stay long in closed parishes, that the farmers wanted to move them on quite quickly, because if you stayed as a servant in a parish for a year or more, you became entitled to a settlement in that parish. In other words, you became eligible to receive poor relief from the parish. And particularly in closed parishes, which were trying to keep their poor rates down, there was a tendency at the end of the year or just before the end of the year to move farm servants and farm labourers on. But actually, the evidence now suggests that this was perhaps more myth than reality, and that because there were other ways in which farmers could control their working population, there were instances of farm labourers staying within farms within the parish for a good part of their working lives. And in fact, one labourer in Humberston actually qualified for a prize in the Lincolnshire County Show for being the labourer who had stayed longest with a single family through his working life. And if someone's done a study of the neighbouring parish of Tetney, and it's quite obvious that the turnover in farm labourers and farm servants was much less than you might have expected.
Well, talking of like neighbour, we've just about sort of come to a close. A couple more questions, if you can answer them relatively quickly, please. But on sort of the influence of neighbouring areas, Ken Redmore's asked, what's the impact of Grimsby, which is only 5 miles from Humberston after all? Yes.
Well, of course, Grimsby was moribund until the railways arrived in the 1850s. After so it had a slight impact before then. The market was in decline. There wasn't much shipping going in and out of the port, so it served as a local centre, but not as a major outlet for farm produce. When the railways arrived, then that began to change. People began to look towards Grimsby, began to migrate towards Grimsby to move their products through Grimsby. And by the early 20th century, the opposite happened, and the people who had made their money in fishing moved out to Humberston. They built themselves fine villa residences in the nice rural parts of the parish.
Lucky them. So just one more. Valerie asks, did the poor performance of the parson you mentioned impact the poor in the parish, and if so, how?
No, interestingly, no. It's a good question. No, because the farmers had such a tight control of the vestry, and therefore of the administration of poor relief. And as I said, it was an interesting feature of the way that they managed poor relief, that because all the farmers contributed the rates, it was more advantageous to them to take the poor onto their own farms and give them work to do than it was to leave the poor at home and simply provide them with subsistence. So no, the farmers had tight control of the administration of poor relief in the parish.
Okay, great. Well, I think I'm going to wrap up now. I don't know, Sarah, whether you can hear me and you want to pop back on screen. There we go. So thanks to both Sarah and Martin for a brilliant session, I thought. And as I say, as somebody coming completely new to this, I learned an awful lot, and I hope everybody else did. Now, normally in a Zoom thing, you'd be able to do like one of the clapping icons, or you could unmute yourself and clap. So I'm hoping that remotely you can applaud and thank our speakers. Now, Andrew, am I right in thinking that obviously there's a lunch break now until 1:30? I would ask everybody to stay in the meeting. Don't go out of the meeting. I mean, you will be able to get back in, but I think, do stay where you are. I think we're all going to turn our cameras off and mute ourselves, our panelists, so that we are not, our lunchtime conversations aren't overheard. Paul, I think, will be playing just the afternoon schedule and some light entertaining music. But otherwise, I think thanks everybody for this morning session, and we'll see you all again at 1:30 for Rob Wheeler and Shirley Brewer.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks very much to both Martin and Sarah for an excellent session.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.